Welcome back to Church Administration 201. This is being taught for Fruitland Baptist Bible College. Today is Lecture 8, Week number 8. Today you're going to learn how to understand the congregational life cycle. Every congregation has a life cycle. It would be good to identify where the congregation you're serving lies on this scale. You'll look at how to diagnose, prevent, and cure the negative aspects of the congregational life cycle, and then some specific aspects of the Hoover change grid will be presented. Now let's get started. In this graphic you will see a bell-shaped curve. This curve can be used as an example of a congregational life cycle. You see it goes from birth on the left-hand side to death on the right-hand side. Now let me try to explain each of these different phases. Phase number 1 is birth. This is when vision is at an all-time high. When a congregation has first been planted or established, the vision is very prominent and it is dominant over almost everything else. There aren't good programs and relationships are being developed, and certainly there's very little structure, but at birth, vision has prominence. There also would be great enthusiasm, and all the people who are in the church would be involved with it. Now, as you continue up on that left side, you'll see the word growth. Now, there's early growth, and then there is later growth or prime growth. Let me talk about early growth first. It's high energy. There's unity of purpose. The individuals who are members of the congregation are all on the same page. They have a vision in front of them, and they're beginning to work on and develop their programs, and their relationships are certainly very, very strong at this point. This is a good place for a church to be. And then you'll notice as we move on up toward the top of the bell curve that it says maturity. This is the place of prime growth. It is at this point that the dream and the beliefs and the goals and the structure of the church have all taken place. It's that point where vision is still prominent, and programs have been developed to get the children in Sunday school and perhaps to have RAs and GAs and a discipleship making process. And so all the programs are in place. And the structure is flexible enough to allow the church to move forward and to accomplish the things that the church wants to do. This is the place that we would call prime growth. It is a time when maybe there will be some fallout because some will not buy into the methodology of the congregation, but it's a time that the church begins to move forward in its peak years. These are good days for the congregation, and frankly, this is where the church needs to remain. You want the church to be on the left side of this life cycle that's before you. You don't want to begin to move into the declining area, because just after maturity has been reached, the congregation can move into that place where it begins to plateau. That is, there's no growth, or it begins to lose members, and there's some dropout. A plateau is when the structure is completed, and there is a direction of the church, but there may be some uncertainty now that has begun to creep in to the congregation. And so the church needs to begin to think about developing forward once again. Now, let's look at the declining side for just a moment. There's early decline, and that's when there's focus on the comfort of the people who are attending the church now. There are a few struggles. Finances are usually good. There are a few challenges that really require the effort of everybody in the church. Now, if you go back to the left side, when growth was taking place, in early growth and maturity, you find that there were many challenges, and the people came together to accomplish them. Now, erosion, when you move back on the other side toward decline, what you find is erosion is slowly but surely beginning to infiltrate the congregation. It may be imperceptible at first, but it is nevertheless there. And then on that same side you will find later decline. There are significant losses. There are significant divisions. People begin to think about the kinds of music they want in the church, and music wars may even break out at that point. There may be worship style battles. There may be battles over how to do previous tasks that were easy to settle beforehand. And then the congregation can move off to the point of death. And you may be thinking, death? Do congregations actually die? Well, in the United States of America alone, every year about 4,000 churches close their doors. About 4,000. That alarms me. And even with new churches being planted, those churches do not replace those that are dying. So this is a congregational life cycle. Now, where is your church on this scale? I want you to think about that. And I want you to put together your best thoughts about where your church is. You see, the longer a church exists, the more concerned it becomes with self-preservation, and the less it becomes concerned with its original purpose. You may be interested in continuing to study this particular aspect of congregational life, and if so, you might go to Robert Dale's wonderful little book, To Dream Again. In that book, he goes into great detail about the congregational life cycle. Now in this slide, you see a slightly different bell-shaped curve. It is very similar to the one that you saw on the previous slide, but let me share with you the differences. Instead of birth, growth, maturity, decline, and death, we find replacing those words, beginning on the left-hand side, you'll find dream, beliefs, goals, structure, ministry. Then going down the right side, nostalgia, questioning, polarization, and dropout. Now let me share some things with you about this new graph. Dream is your vision. It's where you believe God wants to take you. Do you remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s wonderful speech that he shared? And in that speech he talked about, I have a dream. His dream was to see the United States together, functioning as not black and white people, but as people. He had a dream. What is your dream? And on this bell-shaped curve, that dream represents your vision. Now what about your beliefs? What are the things you'd go to the mat for? As a church, what are those doctrines that you're going to celebrate? I hear so many churches talk about the fact that we believe in evangelism. I look at their calendar and I recognize that they don't have time set aside for evangelistic outreach. I look at their budget and I discover that that's not really one of their beliefs because they don't have anything in their budget for evangelism. And then goals. What do you want to accomplish? How can you quantify where you're going and what you want to achieve? And then structure. How do you get it done? What documents guide you? What documents provide the course of the direction and undergird your dream and your beliefs and your goals? Oftentimes our documents or our structure interferes with the advancement of the kingdom of God. And then when you get to the top of the bell-shaped curve here, you see ministry. Ideally, ministry is done more effectively when the beliefs and the dreams and the goals and the structure all align so that good ministry takes place. You will remember, looking at the previous graph, that when we come to the right-hand side of the curve, it specifies decline and death. Now, this new graph talks about nostalgia first. That is, how did things used to look? How did we used to do things? Common conversation would take place saying, do you remember how we used to do this or how we used to do that? Do you remember when our Sunday school attendance was 500 or 400? And it's nostalgia. It's redreaming what took place years ago without a plan in place to move toward the future. And there's a time of questioning. Often these questions revolve around the staff. Do we have the right leaders here? Do these leaders feel called here? Do they continue to want to serve here in this place? They're not as effective as they should be, and they're not meeting our expectations. And then the congregation can become polarized. Those are people who support the pastor. Those are people who are supporting the other faction in a conflict. And so there are sides that are chosen. Often those sides will have distinct leadership that will be providing the direction for them to go. And then often you have dropout when you reach this point. That is, there are those that do not want to be a part of the church any longer. They're going to another church. I don't like conflict, so I'm going to another place. This church isn't doing anything effectively. We're moving somewhere else. And so that is another way to look at this life cycle. Now I want you to look at your church. Do you have a clearly defined vision? What are your beliefs? What are your core values as a congregation? What goals have you established for this next year? For the next 3 to 5 years? What are your goals? And does your structure help you to accomplish the goals, the beliefs, and the vision? Or are they impediments to accomplishing these things? Before you have the same graph, only this time you will find diagnosis, cure, and prevention. Now, if you will simply remember the first graph that we saw, on the right-hand side, there was early decline, and then it moved to later decline and death. Those are similar types of stages as we're looking at now. They roughly correspond with nostalgia, questioning, polarization, and dropout. Once a church reaches the point of early decline or nostalgia, they need to recognize that they must redevelop forward. I use the term redevelop forward because we're not going back to the other side of the bell-shaped curve. We're actually producing a different bell-shaped curve that helps us go forward to address the dreams, the beliefs, the goals, and the structure of our church. So in reality, the diagnosis, the cure, and the prevention are all the same thing. We must dream again. About every 7 to 8 years, a church must reach the point of developing a new vision. If you're a pastor who's been at a particular church or a staff member at a church for 5, 6, or 7 years, it's time for you to redevelop a vision for that congregation. A vision that will hold them together, that will be clear and concise and compelling. A vision that will help people move toward the future. If we do not become proactive and invest our energies and our talents and our resources on our dream and our beliefs, our goals, and our structure, and move to that left-hand side of the bell-shaped curve once again, then we will move toward greater decline and perhaps even death. So where are you? Do you need to begin redreaming, revisioning, putting together a new dream or new vision for your congregation? I encourage you to do just that. And particularly if you've been there 7, 8, or 9, or 10 years, it's time to revision. I would encourage you to pick up some of the literature by Bob Dale or other very fine writers and revision by redreaming the dream. In this slide, you have before you the Hoover Change Grid. It again is a bell-shaped curve, but you will find different wording along the bell shape of that curve. You'll find mission, values, vision, strategy, suspended, operational, ideological, ethical, and absolute. Those words refer to doubts, and we will discuss that in just a few moments. The Hoover Change Grid talks about how we get to the pinnacle of ministry, but then it talks about some different kinds of doubts, 5 different kinds of doubts that sometimes set in with a congregation. Now you notice the first word, mission. That just simply is to try to identify who are we? Who are we as a congregation? Values, what's important to us? What are our core values? What do we put great importance on? And then vision, where do we want to go? Where will we go in our future? And then the last one is strategy. That is, how are we going to get there? We know what we want. We know where we want to go. We know what importance we put on it. We know who we are. But how are we going to get there? It's an important question. You'll notice the peak of this bell-shaped curve is the golden era. There's a danger when you reach the peak, whether it would be the peak of ministry or perhaps it would be the peak of maturity that we've already discussed. But there's a danger. And the danger is this: sometimes we want to stay there. But you cannot stay there. You're either going to go to the right or you're going to go to the left. You will, if you try to stay, begin to stagnate. Mythologies will begin to develop about the good old days. but the tendency is to edit out the bad mythologies. At the point of the pinnacle of the curve, we find that doubts are all suspended. We're going to take a look at each one of these doubts, and let's break these doubts down one by one. Number one is suspended doubt. During that period of time, it again is just past peak, and there is high morale in the congregation. There is a sense of we can accomplish this, we're going to do it together, and there is a can-do attitude. Actions and expectations are well integrated, and it causes people to be very happy. Unfortunately, suspended doubt doesn't last very long. When we begin to continue down the right side of the Hoover change grid, we reach operational doubt. This is doubt about specific programs or procedures that we follow. This is when people begin to question, do those programs still work? Are those programs still effective? Do we want to still engage in placing our money and our resources and our time in those programs? Or what about our procedures? Have we reached the point in our history that we need to change our procedures? They don't seem to be working for us anymore. People begin to deviate from norms in their behavior, and they may act differently than they did before. During this stage, I've seen leaders approach other leaders and talk to them in this term: that was so unlike you to engage in that kind of behavior. At this point of operational doubt, attendance begins to drop, and so does productivity. It begins to drop as well. And then you reach ideological doubt. Members begin to question assumptions in the system. Those assumptions were valued in the system before, but now they're being questioned. Tension is developing, and when you walk in the building, you can sense that tension, or you can see the tension in the body language of the people. Questions are asked, and it's a why question. This why question reflects a deep level of doubt. Why are we doing Sunday night worship service in the first place? Why are we doing visitation on Tuesday nights in the first place? The natural tendency is to try to return to the golden era, but that just simply is impossible. The harder we try to go back to that golden era, the more doubts that begin to surface. And then the next step down in this grid is the ethical doubt. There are increasing questions about the direction of the congregation. Alienation begins. Conflict is seen between those people in the congregation that have different views. Some feel personally violated and excluded from the community, and particularly excluded from the decision-making process. Members begin to detach from the church. Values are questioned. The values of the leadership are questioned at this ethical doubt stage. And when the values of the leadership are questioned, they may ask such questions as, now, did we really pray about this? Or another question, do you really believe this? It's very easy to become defensive here, and I would encourage you, if you are a pastor or a minister in that particular position, I would encourage you to be sure that you don't become defensive. And then last is absolute doubt. The people resign, first emotionally, then physically. First, they emotionally disconnect from the congregation, and then their body follows. Cynicism and despair can set in, and communication will begin to stop when you reach absolute doubt. They leave even though they stay. They may stay in the congregation, but emotionally they've already checked out. They will contaminate new people who are coming in. And they begin to ask some questions that have been settled long ago. Who are we and where are we going? At this point, there may be grief and loss and fear associated with the life of the congregation. Absolute doubt is, however, avoidable. We have to redevelop forward, as we discussed before.